Hi everyone. So in this video, we're going to be looking at a last sort of issue regarding the free will defense. And we're going to introduce the idea of natural evil and show how that causes a sort of leftover problem and how it might lead to what's called the evidential problem of evil. So in this video, we'll just briefly talk about the free will defense so far. Then we'll talk about the difference between moral evil and natural evil. And then we'll talk about the problem of natural evil. And then we'll talk about, so is like the free will defense plausible in response to this problem? And then we'll ask, well, does it need to be a plausible response? Then we'll use that to talk about the evidential problem of evil. So remember, the free will defense so far says that the following is a possible world. Free will is a good thing. God's all-knowing and thereby knows a world with free will is better than a world without. God's all good, so God wants there to be free will. God's all powerful, so God can create free will. And so God, being a perfect being, would create a world with free will. However, creating that world of free will, God thereby takes the risk that these creatures will use that free will to do something wrong. And when they use that free will to do something wrong, it brings evil into the world. God doesn't want them to do that evil thing, but God gave them free will, since a world with free will is still better than a world without free will. All right, so we've seen two problems for this defense so far. The first is the free will defense seems to deny that God is omnipotent, since God doesn't have the power to control our choices. The reply to this is, look, God's omnipotence isn't the power to do anything we can describe. It's the power to do all possible things, all the things that actually make sense. And controlling a free choice doesn't make sense. It seems like there's a contradiction. The other worry was the free will defense seems like it must deny omniscience, God's omniscience, because if God has foreknowledge of our choices, then we don't have free will. The first reply we saw says, look, God's omniscience is the ability to know anything, and God chooses not to know our future in order to give us free will. The second reply says, look, omniscience is having all logically possible knowledge. There is no possible or available knowledge of what free creatures will choose to do until they've actually made that choice. So denying that God has foreknowledge of that free choice doesn't limit God's knowledge in any way, since God still has all the knowledge that is actually available at that time. God's knowledge on this view is captured by that sort of branching model of omniscience that we sort of saw last time. There is, however, a leftover problem for the free will defense. Let's assume for the moment that the free will defense can sort of fix those worries regarding God's omnipotence, God's omniscience, and how that relates to free will. Even if you solve those problems, it seems like free will couldn't explain how God would allow all the kinds of evils we see in this world. When we look at the world we live in, we notice two very different kinds of evils in it. There are moral evils and there are natural evils. Moral evil is evil or suffering that results from the free choices of human beings. So some examples of that. The genocide of the Holocaust, South African apartheid, murder, torture, rape. This all includes sort of very severe suffering in the world. But this suffering is a kind of moral evil because that suffering happens as a result of the free choice that someone made, the free choice they chose to send someone to the gas chamber or to kill another person, or they chose to torture another person. So these are moral evils because they are the result of the choices that human beings have made. But natural evils, these are evils or suffering in our world that occur independently of any human being's exercise of free will. So there seem to be a lot of examples of this. So tornadoes, floods, diseases. Nobody decides for there to be cancer. Nobody decides for there to be a tsunami or flood. Nobody decides for animals to suffer. I mean, sometimes they do. So this gets a little tricky. So let's say I throw a plastic ring into the ocean from soda cans, and then a fish gets stuck in it. Well, that animal suffering is the result of my free choice. And similarly, you might sort of say, look, the fact that you chose to live in an area where there's tornadoes, well, the fact that people sort of suffer as a result of that tornado is partly a sort of result of their choice to live there. But notice, nobody chooses for tornadoes to exist. Nobody chooses for hurricanes to exist. Nobody chooses for cancer to exist. All right, so these seem to be natural evils that just occur in our world independently of any choices we made. Or for animal suffering, here's an example that William Rowe gave. Imagine there's a baby deer, a fawn, in a forest, and there's a lightning storm. Lightning hits, the tree falls over, lands on the fawn, and it sits there in agonizing pain for 3 days until it dies. All right. This clearly, we have every reason to think this kind of evil exists in the world, and clearly that fawn's pain and suffering and death is not the result of any human being's free choice. Now, moreover, keep in mind, animals existed and suffered severe suffering and pain before humans existed. So clearly that pain and suffering is not the result of any human being's free choice. The problem: the free will defense might show the possibility of God creating a world with moral evil in it. However, it looks like there would still be a contradiction between God creating a world with natural evil in it. Here's a reply, though, that is given in the dialogue. It's possible that God created free creatures other than humans, like the devil or demons, and natural evils might be caused by the choices of other free creatures. All right, so the tornado, the flood, the tsunami, the diseases, that fawn suffering in the forest, yes, they are not the result of God creating human beings with free will, who then cause those evils, but God could have created other free creatures, like the devil or demons, and it's possible that that other suffering is the result of their free choices. All right, so this is what Wryrob, the atheist in the dialogue, has to say in response here. She says, so your idea is that the world contains the devil, and who knows how many other free creatures who are causing problems for us. So that crack in California, the San Andreas fault, the explanation is that the devil did it, or some imp or poltergeist or whatever. That's great, Sam, really great. I not only don't believe that, I don't believe that you believe it. So Wyrob's pointing out something really interesting here. She's saying, look, that's not how we believe that earthquakes work. It's not how we believe that disease works. It's not how we believe that earthquakes, tornadoes, floods, and tsunamis work. We have natural explanations for how those things occur in the world. We don't need to appeal to any demons or poltergeist to explain why that natural evil occurs. And she says, moreover, it's not just that it seems implausible that she doesn't accept that idea. She thinks the theists themselves, Sam, if they're so rational, doesn't believe that that's really what's happening, causing the earthquakes to occur. All right, now, here's what Sam Miller in the dialogue has to say in response. Wait a minute, Gretchen. I don't claim to believe it. The point simply is that there may be all kinds of benign and evil agents, all sorts of forces for good and evil, who are exercising their free will that affects the lives of humans and of other animals, even baby bats. So the example from the dialogue was a baby bat falling off into bat guano and suffocating in bat poop, which we have every reason to believe happens. That's another example of natural evil. But, so Sam Miller goes on, I certainly don't claim that you will or should believe it. Remember the rules. I just claim that it's a consistent, coherent possibility. My defense, my amalgam of Christian doctrine and legend serves not as a hypothesis, but merely as a proof of consistency. That's all I claim for it. All right, so what Miller is doing here is saying, look, no, I don't believe this. I'm not saying that this is what causes earthquakes, floods, or tsunamis, or animal suffering. I'm just trying to show you that here's a story, and it's a really implausible, and it's one that I think is false, but it's a story that makes sense. It's possible. And so that shows how these natural evils that we see in the world, it's possible for them to coexist with God, and shows that there's no contradiction between them. Wryrob goes on, I suppose there's no getting around it. I should have never agreed to those rules. They let Sam and his God off the hook so easily. Right at this moment, I can't say that I see a contradiction in your story, Sam. It's fantastic and absurd. I know you only present it as a proof of possibility, therefore you win. Your proof, however, has not exactly instilled religious fervor in me. So here, Weyerhaeuser seems to be suggesting that evil seems to pose a problem for theism that goes beyond the mere logical problem. And thus, she thinks she shouldn't have set the bar so low for a theist defending their beliefs in the face of the evil we see in this world. She thinks, look, it seems like there's still a reason to think that evil might make these beliefs irrational, even if they're not contradictory. What's being hinted at here by Weyerhaeuser is what's known as the evidential argument from evil. Here's how it goes. It says, look, if God exists, then God would not permit gratuitous evil. Think evil that exists for no greater reason. There are some actual evils in the world that humans cannot think of any plausible God-justifying reason for permitting them. So this just says, when we look at a lot of the evils that exist in this world, when we try to come up with even a halfway plausible explanation for why an all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing God would allow those evils, we come up empty-handed. So probably there aren't any God-justifying reasons for permitting those evils that we see. There's probably gratuitous evil in this world. Therefore, probably God does not exist. Now notice, merely pointing out the possibility of a greater good that would justify God in allowing certain evils does not respond to this argument. Premise 2 doesn't say that there aren't any possible greater goods to the evils we see. It denies that we can't think of any halfway plausible greater goods for the actual evils we see. So possible goods might be incredibly implausible. And so the question from premise 2 is whether or not anything we can come up with is plausible, not just possible. So for instance, take the fawn that is sort of a lightning strikes the forest, a tree sort of falls over on it and crushes that fawn that dies in agonizing pain, suffers in agonizing pain for 3 days until it finally dies. It is when we try to sort of come up with a plausible sounding reason why an all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing God would allow that fawn to suffer in that way, we just can't come up with anything that's even halfway plausible. So for instance, you might say, well, maybe that fawn dying, it sort of gave food to some other animals there and stopped them from starvation. And that seems to be a greater good. The problem with that, though, is that's not plausible because if God's all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-good, God could have put that fawn out of its misery much quicker and painlessly. Why did it have to suffer for 3 days in agonizing pain? Presumably, God could have gotten that same good of saving those other animals from starvation without going through such terrible evil or suffering on behalf of that fawn. Now you might say, well, hold on, what about, yet again, there's the possibility that there's the devil or the poltergeist doing it to this fawn. Now the claim, though, is that that's not plausible. It goes against everything we know about how the natural world works. We have an explanation for why the world leads to some earthquakes, floods, and tsunamis, and we have no reason to believe that these earthquakes, floods, and tsunamis are being caused by a devil or a poltergeist. And so even though that's a possible explanation, it's not plausible because it doesn't fit with what we know about the world. All right. So here's a question. So what should we think about this new version of the challenge from evil? Well, philosophers have thought about that quite a bit. This is the version of the problem of evil. This evidential version, that's the version that's been discussed the most since it was introduced about 50 years ago. Now, I'm going to leave you to think about it. There's a number of things you might sort of say. I mean, you might sort of try to say, well, look, yeah, you're right. We can't think of any plausible reason, but maybe our failure to come up with even a halfway plausible reason doesn't really justify thinking that there isn't a reason out there. Or maybe you might be able to come up with a plausible reason for why God would allow a lot of the evils we see. I'm going to leave you to try to think through what you think would be the best strategy. Now, if you want to look at the issue in more detail, you can take Philosophy of Religion course at Tuskegee, or you could email me and I could suggest a few articles related to that. I just want you to know that the discussion of the logical problem is not all there is to discuss when thinking about the challenge posed by the existence of evil. So even if you resolve that logical problem successfully, there might be an even more difficult problem that in this version of the evidential problem. So that's it for this week. Don't forget to tune in for the Zoom discussion sessions because we're going to have time for review for the midterm exam. Come prepared with any questions you have about any of the material or anything you want to review. See you then. Bye-bye.